Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are excited to talk about spooky things, ghostly noises, like I can hear some in the background right now, and writing suspenseful scenes and suspenseful plots. And we hope maybe Scarlett will be joining us later. We will see. She's keeping us in suspense. But first of all, let's just catch up and see what everyone's been working on lately. Alicia, what about you? What's been going on writing-wise?
Still working on that fantasy, the historical fantasy. Hoping for the end of the year. Shooting for that.
Yes, we're excited. Okay, I love it. And Jenny, what about you?
I am still waiting on an edit letter from my editor for book 2. She was been out of the office for just a little bit for a family thing, so that's been just kind of delayed a little bit. So I'm waiting on that so I can figure out exactly how little life I'm going to have in the next couple of months. So doing that and starting to think about the project after that and Halloween and all of that.
All of those things. I love it. So you're also being kept in suspense.
Yes. Very suspenseful.
We're talking about it today. And so, Jenny, you just had your debut YA thriller come out recently. And so, of course, that's all about creating suspense, both like on the scene level and then the overall plot and kind of drawing that out. So when you're plotting and planning this kind of in the pre-writing stage, how do you start to plan for like building in that suspense?
Well, for me, for this book in particular, because it was my first kind of thriller that I'd written, that was a really good question that I wanted to make sure there was lots of suspense and lots of tension in it. And I did, before I started writing, probably one of the easiest ways to ever add suspense and tension to a story, which is I gave that story sort of a ticking clock. A time bomb, if you will. It wasn't an actual bomb. In this story, it's a hurricane. But you know that hurricane is coming and you know the timeline for it. And every time you turn the page, you're getting closer to that hurricane and we're getting reports on it and we know it's getting closer, and it's going to make landfall. So that was the first thing I did right off, like overall, to give the whole arc of the story that tension and suspense, was drop that sort of that ticking clock into it right at the beginning.
Yeah, I love that. And that's just such a great device that we can do. Like you said, it's kind of in the background. It's sort of part of the atmosphere, but it's always there, just kind of keeping us on our toes throughout. So I love that. And Alicia, so you're plotting a book that has a lot of suspense. I'm guessing there's poisoning going on, murders and whatnot. So what are you thinking like in the drafting stage about adding in those suspenseful elements?
For me, I tend to try to like drop in something either that places two characters against each other, or the reader knows that one character is doing X and the other character does not know. And so like you let that sit for a couple of chapters, and that like draws out the tension or the suspense of like the reader waiting for that the other character to like finally realize it and or be hurt by it.
Yeah, I think that's really key. And that's kind of where I start, although like I wouldn't describe any of my books as thrillers. But even so, there's always going to be some kind of element of suspense, because we know that really important things are at stake for our characters. So I start by establishing those characters in a way that they feel real and you relate to them, and maybe you like fall in love with these characters a little bit, so that when we start to see that the things that they want are maybe going to be impossible to get, or the things that they care about or like put in danger, any of those things, we feel it like in our gut. And like if you can make them feel it, it's all going to feel much more important and suspenseful when those things start happening. And I was trying to think about my books, which my middle grade novels that are out right now are kind of more like contemporary, realistic mixed with fantasy. So kind of like magical realism, a little bit of like a quieter pacing and whatnot. But I did have sort of a ticking clock in like The Secret Life of Sam. So when you have Sam, the main character, who discovers this doorway in a tree near his school where he's been dragged away from his home in the swamps where he lived with his dad after his dad dies in a car accident, and taken to this small town in Oklahoma with an aunt he barely knows. And he discovers that there's this tree, and once a day at the exact time of his dad's accident, the hollow in the tree turns into a doorway that lets him climb back to his home in the swamps and be with his dad once more, who doesn't realize that he's dead. But the ticking time bomb or time clock or whatever comes in when he learns from his guide to this other world that the doorway won't stay open long. And so every time he goes in, it's like shorter, and like it's getting closer and closer and closer to the time when the doorway will close for good. So he has to find a way to keep it open, or to maybe get his dad like out from that other world back into the real world. So yeah, even if you have like a kind of quieter story, you can still include those elements. And it's important to include those elements, like no matter what type of story it is, to keep the readers really coming back for more. But there's a lot that goes into suspense, like especially, so Ginny, in yours, when you have something that involves like a missing person, like possibly a murder victim, and lots of suspects out there, like how do you create suspense around like the possibilities of what might have happened to this person, and kind of keep people guessing about who might have done it?
I like what you said about caring about the characters, like starting with characters that people are interested in. And I talked about this exact thing with a group of like young writers a couple of days ago, like kids. And I talked about why that's important, why we have to care about your characters, because if we don't care about the character to start with, we don't care whether or not they get eaten by a monster or whatever, right? So for me, that's how I start with character, much like you do. And when you're talking about like a thriller or a missing person mystery, and you've got everyone in this small town that is sort of, a suspect or maybe involved or has some secret knowledge, I think if you can get the reader to care about all of them, then you've really done something great, because we have to care about not only the person who's sort of the main character, but we really need to care about those people that are the suspects too. Like, oh, please don't let it be this person. I really like them. Or, oh my gosh, I hope it's not this person. This person's my favorite. And I think that's one of the things that works pretty well in Dark and Shallow Lies, is that you've got these theories all along about, oh gosh, maybe it's this person, and oh gosh, no, now I think it's this person. But the problem is you sort of like them all, and you're sort of drawn to all of them, and you don't really want it to be any of them. So I think kind of that tangled up idea of who might be guilty and who might be innocent, and who we're sort of pulling for, who we're drawn to in the story, is a really good way to kind of pull readers in, and get them sort of on the edge of their seat.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And of course, that goes back to something I know we've talked about before with villains and monsters and things like that, and making them the hero of their own story. So I definitely want to talk about that. But I also want to remind people that we are taking your questions in the chat. So if you have a question, get that one in there. But yeah, let's talk about villains. I mean, I love this idea, like you want to love them like in a certain way. You want to care about them. And it's really fun to try to make your villains be like endearing in that way. And Alicia, I know you have a main character that some might consider a villain that you're working on right now. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Actually, both of my point of view characters, I kind of came into writing the story with the question of what makes a villain and what makes a hero. And so my two main characters, in their own story, believe they are heroes. But to people outside, like, Yeah. So if you don't see them as a hero, you probably see them as a villain. So what I've had to do, which has been the hardest part, is setting them up to be basically morally gray, where they're doing good things that the reader can see as like, yes, I agree, this is good. And then slowly moving that character to make a decision that might not be 100% good. And then do another decision that's like maybe 50% good. And then another decision where the reader would then question, okay, I don't know if this one's the hero. It's been hard, but it's been really fun. But yeah, I think what both of you have said already is the key is to build up a character before all the bad stuff happens so that the reader like is invested, meaning it's not just like character flaws like, oh, they're shy or they're like naive and they trip over their own feet. It's like what makes them human, what in their past or in their current, what do they care about, why do they think they're a hero. If you can get readers invested in that and then take them on a journey that might be like a downward spiral, um, then and I think those are the most fascinating characters. Is like I'm on board right away, and then they start doing things, and I'm like, I think I'm still on board.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I don't think I've ever written a protagonist yet that's quite that type of like anti-hero or like but one day I absolutely will. And I'm trying to think of like the villains in my books. And I think my stories that are published right now like don't necessarily have villains, but the villains in them are more like death or like the Grim Reaper, like death personified. And the whole story is really about like revealing the lighter side of the things that we think of as like the ultimate evil or as like only evil. And so that's definitely like in Skeleton Tree, when you obviously have like the personification of death that's growing in Stanley's backyard. And so, automatically it's like, oh, well, it's the villain, like it's the evil thing that's going to like take his sister away from him. Well, of course, it's like a story about Stanley kind of changing his understanding and relationship with death. And so we get to see this character of the skeleton portrayed in ways that are not what you might typically expect for the Grim Reaper. So he's like the one who's afraid of Stanley, and his main thing is like to be whimsical and bring joy to Stanley's little sister and like do shadow puppets and like spin this basketball on his finger and all this stuff. So, and then, in this story, like my goal too is like there's the mysterious character of the girl that Gabe meets in the woods who knows all these things about him after he has died, but is still up and walking around and feels fine and was chased out of town by all of his terrified friends and neighbors. And so we learned that like she might be a character like this, like sort of like a Grim Reaper. But my goal was that like in the end, which provide too many spoilers, but I mean, when he like ultimately the relationship ends toward the end of the book, like my goal is that this is like a really sad moment. It's like you've come around to see this character that's like a Grim Reaper, but hopefully you've like fallen in love with her and like believe in their friendship. And so when it ends, there's like just trying to get that little jab of sadness out of you, right? Like that's a lot of what we do as writers. Like we want to hit you like where it hurts, but in a good way. And I think that ties into suspense and scariness. So we talked a lot about suspense, but it is the Halloween season.
I have a question for both of you.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about like suspense and thrillers and like this is Halloween. So I also think of like creepy. How do you creep your reader out?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because like scaring someone is similar to suspense, but it's different. I mean, there are a lot of different types of scares that we can have. Ginny, what would you say about that? There are some scary like moments in your playlist.
For me, and one thing that works really well for me is to try to build moments of quiet and silence into the story. And I always try to explain, like if you're watching a horror movie, right? It's not the moment where like the monster or the killer jumps out and grabs you that is the really scary moment. I mean, we jump at that and we scream because it's like a reflex, right? But that's not the part that's scary. The part that's scary is the part where the person is like creeping up the stairs, holding their breath, reaching for the doorknob and waiting to see what's there. So for me, one of the ways that I build tension and creepiness into that particular kind of story is to make sure there's lots of lead up and lots of build up to those moments, and that most often those moments are not big. You don't make them larger. I tend to make them smaller and smaller and smaller, and compact them down and make them tiny moments, because that's where the tension is to me. And the other way I do it is just through lots of atmosphere in the stories, like particularly in Dark and Shallow Lies, because it's set in the bayou. There's a lot of darkness there and a lot of danger that's just like inherent in that setting. So to play with that atmosphere was a really fun and easy way to do it in that story in particular.
Yeah, I love atmosphere too. And like a lot of my books are not like, my goal isn't necessarily to scare people, but I love kind of the beauty and the whimsy of like darkness and like spookiness and scary things. So I want to create like a sense of wonder, I guess, but a sense of wonder that is driven by like the darker, spookier side of things. So I love that. But I do have one like horror story that is a straight up horror story, a short story in this collection, Don't Turn Out the Lights, called Jingle Jangle. And I really, really had fun writing this. And so you can see it features a straight up monster. There's the Jingle Jangle Man. And it was really fun to write. It's just, I wrote it intending it to be kind of a read aloud, because it's a tribute to the scary stories, to tell the dark stories that were like read, out loud with like jump scares and all those things at the end. So yeah, it's like a classic revenge tale of like, there's this legendary creature in this small town that supposedly lurks behind the thorns. And if you recite this certain poem, basically it will appear and get revenge on someone for you. But of course, revenge has like terrible consequences. So I just had a lot of fun really like diving in to describing this monster. And like, there's always that question of, like you said, I totally agree. Like when you're leading up to something really scary, like a scary scene, it is all about that lead up and the anticipation. And then when you get there, you have to make the decision, how much do you show and how much do you not show? Because sometimes not showing the monster is absolutely the scariest way to go. And it's your imagination that's more powerful than anything you can put on the page. And sometimes it's really fun to kind of like dive into that description. And like, I do that in here, like every sense is invoked. Like you can just hear the little like hard-shelled beetles crawling around his ribs and making this sort of like, ticking little dance. And he carries this like skin sack behind him everywhere. So you can hear the skin sack just sluicing across the grass as he goes. And so every sense, and I just drag this description out so you get this like really vivid image of the Jingle Jangle Man as he's approaching. And still the boy, the main character, like, of course, didn't quite believe this was going to happen. And then the one thing that I don't show, though, is what happens when he gets to his stepdad's house, who's the one who is actually terrible and is the one that he's wanting to get revenge on. So all that happens is he hears it from outside, and like all of his neighbors are standing outside also listening to what's happening. And you just hear the sounds of his stepdad like being ripped apart, basically. And then when the Jingle Jingle Man comes out, he's wearing parts of his body like draped around him like scarves, and like his eyes like hanging out of his socket and all this stuff. And so I had so much fun with that. And it was just like delighting in the gore of it all. But also like for me, it's about like trying to find, even in that situation that's so dark and disturbing and twisted, like finding some kind of beauty. And for me, it's like the beauty of the language with that sort of thing. It's like, I love doing stuff like that. But yeah, so that's just one way to make it scary. And then of course, it always has to come back to something that directly affects your character in the end. So you can't just call up some creature to get revenge on you and then live happily ever after. No, of course not. So in the end, of course, the repercussions for the main character are really terrifying. So that's also the fun part and how you can make it really scary. But Alicia, you asked about the scary elements. So do you have some scary scenes in your work in progress, and how have you amped up the scariness?
I don't know if they're scary like that. They're not gory, though I love gore, and I feel like I should add gore or have a story. But yeah, this one isn't. It's not the typical like sword and shield type of fantasy. So there isn't a lot of scary moments. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have an answer for that.
Well, no, we can't have them in every book, but it is fun when you can have those monsters. I know, Jenny, you have some kind of monsters in your story, or hints at monsters. And actually, I just turned a book into my agent that's a middle grade that is my most fantastical of fantasies. Like all my books previously are set in the real world, and they're probably about like 10% magic to 90% just realism, right? But the one I just turned in kind of reverses that. So it's like a full-on portal fantasy about this girl who gets kidnapped by what is essentially like a shape-shifting ferret demon and a creepy other mother who's trying to replace her dead children. And she gets taken to the world underneath her favorite graveyard where she always hangs out, and then she has to like escape, etc. So it's really fun, and I got to write some fun monsters there. But I'm wondering, Ginny, so when you were thinking of your kind of like hints at creatures and whatnot, like you were drawing on some real legends, right? Did that help you kind of like create those monsters?
It did, yeah. Because Dark and Shallow Lies is set in the Bayou, and there are, although the main character in the story is not of Cajun or Creole descent, she's kind of an outsider who comes into that community. But because a lot of the like secondary characters are, I knew I wanted to pull some of that folklore into the story. So we've got the Rougarou in there, who is basically like the Cajun werewolf. And if you've been to New Orleans or you've been down in Cajun country, you may have seen like, you know, paintings and drawings of him. And he's a pretty cool monster. So I knew I wanted him in there. I've also got, you know, some other sort of legends, like there's the ghost lights, the swamp lights, and things like that, that supposedly the Fifale, they will lead you to Jean Lafitte's pirate treasure if you are lucky. But if you're not lucky, they will lead you astray and further into the bayou until you're like hopelessly lost forever. And there's several other things like that are in there. For me, because it's not a monster story, really at heart, I wanted those stories more to add like flavor and character to the location and to the story than to be like the central core of the story. But as you know, in that particular story, sort of as you go into it, you realize that there definitely are monsters there. They're just probably not the monsters that we thought they might be at the beginning. So yeah, I love monsters. They're lots of fun.
Yes, indeed. And I do want to just remind anyone watching that you can ask your questions in the chat, and we're actually going to finish up early today. So definitely get those questions in pretty soon if you have any out there. But yeah, I do love creating monsters, and I definitely, in the story that I just turned in, there are quite a few monsters, and there's definitely like one primary monster, which is kind of the other mother figure, a la like Coraline, which I love too. Who has the full backstory, and like, you know, exactly like why she's doing what she's doing, and you can kind of understand it. Like she was sort of pulled in as well by this more like demonic figure or whatever, who just kind of played on all of her desperate need to get her children back. But I had fun playing with the kind of demon ferret, as I call him, and making him kind of just like pure evil. Like sometimes I think it's fun to have like a character that is pure evil in a story.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but did you say demon ferret?
Yeah, obviously.
That's what I heard.
Okay, I couldn't decide if you were saying demon fairy, and then I thought, no, she said ferret. I'm pretty sure she
I
said
just think
ferret.
their little
I'm in
elongated
for that.
bodies are so creepy, especially since he's always
like a
on
demon
his hind
weasel.
legs. Like, so
Yeah.
he's like, yeah.
Awesome. That
And
sounds
he can
creepy. You're right.
Shapeshift and grow and bulge into this like giant ferret. So, and also take human form. But yeah, yes, I think that's fun. But I'm always thinking of, as I'm like writing these spooky kind of scary scenes. Yeah, okay, well, and we have a question from Amy. How do you feel about villains with no redeeming quality? Yes, and I think on occasion, it's fun to play with villains with no redeeming qualities. And that's basically like in this story, that's essentially what that character is. Now, it's kind of hinted that these creatures who live in this world underneath the graveyard have become so twisted over the years that maybe at one time they had some redeeming qualities, but like at this point, it's just all been like sucked out of them. And so that's kind of like who this character is. But because I did that and I really wanted to have this one character that like just had no redeeming quality, I purposely made kind of his counterpart, like the other mother, I delved into her backstory and I made sure that the characters, even though they've been kidnapped by her and she's done like horrible, horrible things, they find a way to kind of understand why she did it and like identify with that. So like having a counterpart. But yeah, I'm curious to see what other people think about having villains with no redeeming qualities. Like, do you need some kind of thing to counterbalance that, or can that just be your villain?
I think, for me, it depends very much on the story and sort of the role your villain is playing. A lot of times, like in the stuff that I write, because it is like very much reality based, but with sort of a paranormal or magical like twist to it. Sometimes those villains are the people in the story, and sometimes they're this like paranormal element or whatever. And I'm much more inclined to be interested in maybe a paranormal villain that doesn't have any redeeming qualities or any backstory, because maybe he is just an evil like soul munching ghost, and that is all there is to it. But if we're talking about people, for me, it's much more interesting to have a villain who is human, who has some redeeming qualities, or at least maybe not redeeming qualities, but something that helps us get inside their head a little bit, or at least understand why they don't have any redeeming qualities. Like what is their trauma? What is their baggage? What has gone wrong in their life? So I think for me personally, I do like my villains to have a little bit of something underneath that makes me wonder if at least they might have some redeeming qualities.
I like that you say that you like them to have some sort of quality or reason, like that you understand what made them a villain with no redeeming qualities. That's what I like. If I can understand why a villain is 100% evil and I agree with the reason, then I'll love them. I would be like, yes, that's a valid reason. Just go murder everybody. I'm behind you. But yeah, I have to have some sort of like understanding. If it's just a villain given to me and I'm shown that they're 100% evil with no redeeming qualities and no reason as to why, unless, like you said, it's like a paranormal, like a ghost that it's a ghost and ghosts do ghost things. That is fine, yeah. But I think if it's a human, I need to have a reason or like understand why they have no redeeming qualities. And that in itself, like their backstory is basically their redeeming quality.
Yeah, and often the most interesting thing. And I think it's also interesting to talk about this kind of supernatural versus real life villain in the context of writing middle grade, because it's much easier to have a supernatural villain be evil, because that just by its very nature is less scary, and it's less heavy to have like a ghost or whatever kind of shape-shifting ferret you want to have out there that is doing these evil things, than to try to explain why real people do real life bad things to each other, right? It's a lot less scary to explain the supernatural villains. But I like to do maybe not villains, but certainly like a lot of imperfect characters in middle grade. But yeah, you do need to give a touch of a backstory or an explanation or something to humanize them. And I do that a lot with the parents. Like I have a lot of imperfect parents in a lot of my stories, but they'll generally have some kind of moment where they come to an understanding. Like in Bone Hollow, Gabe's parents have died, and so he lives with this woman, Miss Cleo, who isn't part of the family and doesn't seem like, she seems to care about her chickens like way more than him. And throughout the whole story, it's just like you don't really understand like why she is so terrible to him, but they kind of reach this understanding like in the final scene. And so you just get a glimpse of how it was hard for her to like care for other people, and she had a reason for not being able to really care for him. And so all the time I like to have like this complicated parent relationships where they're not exactly the best people and they're not the best parents, but at some point they're going to come to some sort of like understanding about that. So yeah, it's not always villains. Sometimes it's just regular people being imperfect.
You know, I think one thing else I would say about that is the reason I like to have, either a villain or an antagonist that does have some of those redeeming qualities, or there at least has something that humanizes them, is for me, and particularly writing YA, one of the most interesting parts of the story is the relationship between, your main character and your villain, right? That push and pull, whatever it is. And it's really hard to have a relationship with something that's just pure evil, right? So as someone who writes YA, I think that's probably one of the reasons I feel that way, is because I want that relationship between those two characters, where they push against each other. And if one of them is just pure evil, it's hard to build that tension for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely always helps, because it's, in a certain way, it's just about evoking the most pain or the most emotion, like in the reader, like hitting those little pain spots. And so, yeah, like the more that the reader cares, not only about your protagonist, but like if they care about the villain also, and then it's just going to be even worse when they discover like all of the things that come out about like what this villain has done, or like, like in your heart as a reader, like this person didn't, they didn't have to do this, and yet like it came to this point. And so you're like, yeah, like anytime you can hit those pain points, it's just going to make it a stronger story. So I love that. Well, I know we're just about out of time for today, but I want to see if anyone has anything to add as we go into Halloween about suspense and spookiness, and just adding all of those things to your stories, or amping them up in ways that devastate readers, right? Alicia, you're still working on like several drafts now of Demon Book, right? So
Yeah.
Have you kind of taken some lessons along the way about like adding the suspense or like getting the pacing right and things like that?
Oh my gosh, yes. What I said earlier about like putting something in one character's point of view that's going to like impact the other character, and not resolving it for a couple of chapters really helps the tension, because I was like putting it in a character A's chapter, and then the very next character B chapter, like having it happen, and like that's fine, but was missing out on like letting that tension sit and like really like pull out. And then yeah, for pacing, I think I'm going to be working on the next draft because I'm still trying to get like the character stuff down. Like right now I'm about at the midpoint and I'm working with my critique partner about like decision-making points, because usually in the midpoint something happens to make characters like pivot in their plans. And so we're just talking about how things are making sense, like because I have like fantastical things. It's kind of based on some mythology, so trying to figure out the real mythology versus like what I need for my fantasy novel
Yeah.
to work at the right time and at the right pace. But yeah, I really like what Jenny said, and I think I've done this at least in one of my chapters, but I'm going to try to do it in this revision of the midpoint, as the atmosphere, and make it kind of like silent but like close in, because that's exactly what I felt in Dark and Shallow Lies. The creepiness whenever there was this certain character that was being introduced. At first it was always this like really creepy scene, and by creepy I mean, yeah, everything kind of like came in slowly at the, and it was like the surroundings, like there was like, it was dark out, foggy, it was silent, but then you could hear like small things or see something within the darkness. Like, yeah, that's creepy. That's what makes me turn on the light.
I try to explain that, like, when I did that workshop with kids earlier, was like, think of it like in a flashlight beam. So like if it's dark outside and you've got a flashlight, you're only going to be able to illuminate like what you're focused on in that moment. And then before you can show something else, you're going to have to like change the focus of that beam or shine it in a different direction, as opposed to like having a light, overhead light, that's going to light up the whole room.
Everything.
Yeah. So in those moments of tension, I try to light right with like a flashlight instead of like an overhead, not literally, you understand that, but like instead of like an overhead light, I try to think of like a focused flashlight beam.
Ooh, I like that. That's good advice.
Yeah, I love that. And I love, like, Alicia, what you're talking about. It's so true, because it is about the subtlety and drawing things out and making readers wait for it, and like building that sense of anticipation. But I think that, and I do that, I'm guilty of this too, but I think a lot of beginning writers, they always hear like, well, you have to hook them from the first page and you have to grab them right away. And so there's this tendency to want to drop all the clues up front and make the pacing like immediately breakneck, and it never stops. And the issue with that can be that, first of all, you don't have time to settle in with the characters. So you don't have time to they don't have time to get their hooks in you, so that you care about what's happening. And second of all, if you just drop all the clues up front, it's going to be way too obvious what happens or what's about to happen. And it's just going to ruin the entire suspensefulness of the story. And so I think I mentioned this before, but I read a story and from someone who was starting out, and these were like the beginning pages. And in the first chapter, we have the couple that has an incinerator, a huge incinerator in the corner of the backyard. And they have a wall of photos of people that aren't related to them, like dozens and dozens of them, of just different people. And the whole scene, the guy's like slicing things with a knife, like in a really ominous manner. And there were like 3 or 4 other like really, really big clues that came in the beginning, like first chapter, basically, before like anything else. And so if you didn't think that this couple was like murdering people, I don't know what you were reading, right? But like, this is a natural tendency. Like, I do this too, is that you want to take the most exciting stuff and you want to cram it all in there right up front, because you've heard from everybody that you have to grab readers right away. And this is true, but I think it's just, think about the stuff that you have loved, and like, the movies that you have loved and things like that, and how slowly, like really, like it doesn't take much up front to grab the reader, like just a little bit of something unexplained. And like Jenny's talking about, like the atmosphere, just use it to like drag people in little by little by little by little. And that's what will really get us.
Absolutely, because it's the questions, right, that pull us in. And if I see this a lot, like when beginning writers will read early chapters, they will say, well, I don't understand this, or I don't know what this means, or I don't know what this is going to happen. And I always say that's okay, because if you know all the answers right on, there's no reason to keep reading. Like you don't have to answer everything right in the beginning. So definitely draw us in, but draw us in by setting us up with questions, not with answers, right?
Yeah, I love that. And like, it's a whole conversation for another time, I think, because it is possible to veer too far into abstraction and to be too mysterious. Like it's definitely possible to do that also. But yeah, for this discussion, I think, yes, like definitely be posing those questions up front, and don't like necessarily provide us with all the answers right away. But we are out of time, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today and talking spooky and suspenseful things, and a huge thank you to Alicia and Jenny. And if you have an idea for a topic that you'd like us to cover in the future, just drop that in the comments and we would be happy to talk about it. Thanks, everyone.
Happy Halloween, everybody.
Thanks, Amy, for the question.
Have a great day.